I was standing in my driveway at 58 years old, holding a home inspection report that declared my house a death trap, when I realized my own daughter was trying to steal everything I had worked for. The inspector my daughter hired pointed at the foundation with dramatic concern, his voice grave as he explained how the entire structure was compromised and unsafe for habitation. I listened quietly, then pulled out my phone and showed him the comprehensive inspection report from just 4 weeks ago that declared everything perfect. The color drained from his face as he stammered excuses, but I had already seen my daughter's car parked down the street, waiting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Morrison, and I never imagined that the hardest battle of my life would be fought not in a courtroom or a hospital, but in the home where I raised my family for 32 years. The two-story Colonial in Riverside, Connecticut had been my sanctuary since my husband David died of pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. It was the place where my daughter Lauren learned to walk, where we celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, where David and I had planned to grow old together. The house wasn't just property to me. It represented every sacrifice David and I had made, every overtime shift he worked as an engineer, every promotion I earned climbing from receptionist to regional sales director at a medical supply company. When David passed, he left me the house free and clear, along with a modest life insurance policy and my own retirement savings. At 58, I was comfortable, independent, and proud of what we had built. Lauren was 34, married to a man named Brett Holloway who worked in commercial real estate, or at least that's what he claimed to do. I had never been entirely comfortable with Brett. There was something about the way he looked at our home during family dinners, the way he would comment on property values in our neighborhood, the way he asked detailed questions about my financial planning that felt less like concern and more like assessment. Lauren had always been ambitious, a trait I had encouraged when she was younger. She graduated from Boston University with a business degree and worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. On the surface, she and Brett seemed successful. They lived in a modern townhouse in Stamford, drove expensive cars, and took frequent vacations to places I had only seen in magazines. But over the past 2 years, I had noticed changes in Lauren that troubled me deeply. She became distant, visiting less frequently and always with an agenda when she did come by. Our conversations shifted from genuine mother-daughter connection to transactional exchanges about my health, my plans for the future, and increasingly my will. 6 months ago, Lauren had started pressuring me to consider moving into a retirement community. She brought glossy brochures to Sunday dinners, highlighting amenities like fitness centers and social activities, insisting that I would be happier around people my own age. "The house is too big for you now, Mom," she would say with practiced concern. "All those stairs, the yard maintenance, the repairs. What if something happened and you were alone?" I tried to explain that I wasn't ready to leave my home, that I was still active and healthy, that I had friends in the neighborhood and a life I enjoyed. But Lauren persisted with a determination that felt less like daughterly worry and more like something else entirely. She started sending me articles about elderly people who fell in their homes, statistics about the dangers of aging in place, and testimonials from seniors who wished they had moved to assisted living sooner. The campaign was relentless and increasingly uncomfortable. Then, 3 months ago, Lauren brought up the subject of power of attorney. She arrived at my house on a Saturday afternoon with official-looking documents and a story about how responsible adults plan for unexpected health crises. "Mom, this is just a precaution," she insisted as she spread the papers across my dining room table. "If something happened to you, if you had a stroke or an accident, someone needs to be able to make decisions about your care and your finances. It makes sense for that person to be me." I had read the documents carefully, my years in business having taught me never to sign anything without understanding every clause. The power of attorney Lauren wanted me to sign was broad and immediate, giving her control over my medical decisions, my bank accounts, my property, essentially everything. When I questioned why it needed to be so comprehensive, Lauren became irritated in a way that reminded me she had never handled criticism well, even as a child. "Mom, do you not trust me?" she asked, her voice taking on an injured tone that I recognized as manipulation. "I'm your daughter. I'm trying to protect you, and you're treating me like I have some ulterior motive." I told her I needed time to think about it, that I wanted my own attorney to review the documents before signing anything. Lauren's face hardened in a way I had never seen before, and she gathered up the papers with sharp, angry movements. "Fine," she said coldly. "But don't come crying to me when you have a medical emergency, and there's no one who can access your accounts to pay for your care." She left without saying goodbye, and I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks. The silence hurt more than I wanted to admit, but it also gave me time to think clearly about what was happening. I consulted with my attorney, Martin Chambers, who had handled David's estate and my will. Martin was in his 70s, a thoughtful man with silver hair and the kind of measured wisdom that comes from decades of practice. "Patricia," Martin said after reviewing the power of attorney documents Lauren had brought, "this is one of the most aggressive POA forms I have seen outside of cases involving severe dementia or terminal illness. If you sign this, your daughter would have immediate and complete control over every aspect of your life. She could sell your house, drain your bank accounts, make medical decisions against your wishes, all legally and without your consent." The bluntness of his assessment shocked me, but she said it was standard, just a precaution. Martin shook his head slowly. "There is nothing standard about this document. A typical power of attorney can be limited in scope, activated only under specific circumstances like medical incapacity, and structured with safeguards. This document has none of those protections. If I were representing your daughter, I would advise her that requesting this from a healthy, competent parent raises serious ethical questions." I left Martin's office feeling a strange combination of relief that I hadn't signed the papers and grief over what his analysis implied about Lauren's intentions. Was my daughter really trying to take control of my life and assets? The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. 2 weeks later, Lauren called me as if nothing had happened between us. Her voice was bright and cheerful, filled with the kind of forced enthusiasm that made me immediately suspicious. "Mom, I have great news," she announced. "Brett and I want to help you out with the house. We know maintenance is getting expensive, so we have arranged for a home inspector to come do a complete evaluation. That way you will know exactly what repairs need to be done, and we can help you budget for them. It is our treat." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but something about it made my instincts flare with warning. I had just had the house professionally inspected 4 weeks ago, as part of my routine maintenance planning. The inspection had been thorough and comprehensive, conducted by a certified inspector named Robert Chen, who had been recommended by my insurance company. Robert had spent an entire day examining every aspect of the property from the foundation to the roof, and his report had been remarkably positive. The house was solid, well-maintained, with only minor recommendations for things like updating some weather stripping and trimming tree branches away from the roof. I had the report saved on my computer and printed in a folder in my office. "Lauren, I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I actually just had the house inspected last month. Everything checked out fine." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Lauren spoke again, her voice had an edge to it. "Last month? Why didn't you tell me you were getting an inspection done?" "Because I am an adult who handles my own affairs," I wanted to say, but instead I kept my tone neutral. It was just routine maintenance planning. I wanted to know what to budget for in the coming years. Another pause, longer this time. "Well, Mom, I hate to say this, but those routine inspections are not very thorough. Brett knows a guy who does really detailed assessments, the kind that find problems before they become serious. It would be silly not to take advantage of his expertise, especially since we are paying for it." The pressure in her voice was unmistakable. This was not really an offer. It was an expectation, and my refusal was clearly not the response Lauren had anticipated. I found myself agreeing just to end the conversation, telling myself that another inspection could not hurt and might actually provide additional peace of mind. We scheduled it for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. The night before the inspection, I could not sleep. Something about the whole situation felt orchestrated in a way I could not quite articulate. I kept thinking about the power of attorney documents, about Lauren's increasing pressure for me to move out of my home, about the way Brett always seemed to be calculating something when he looked around my property. At 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and went to my office where I kept all my important documents. I pulled out Robert Chen's inspection report and read through it again carefully. The report was 38 pages long, meticulously detailed, with photographs documenting every area of the house. Foundation: excellent condition, no cracks or settling. Roof: replaced 8 years ago. Excellent condition with approximately 12 to 15 years remaining lifespan. Electrical. Updated to code, no safety concerns. Plumbing. Good condition, no leaks detected. HVAC. Well maintained, functioning properly. The list went on room by room, system by system. Robert had found nothing that would require immediate attention, and nothing that would compromise the safety or value of the property. I made copies of the entire report, putting one set in my safe deposit box at the bank and keeping another set in my car. I was not sure why I felt compelled to do this, but my instincts were screaming that I needed to protect this evidence. On Tuesday morning, I made coffee and tried to appear calm when the doorbell rang at exactly 10. The man standing on my porch was about 40, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo I did not recognize and carrying a clipboard and inspection equipment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He introduced himself as Dennis Crawford from Premier Property Assessments and shook my hand with the kind of aggressive firmness that always struck me as compensating for something. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you for allowing me to conduct this evaluation," Dennis said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your daughter and son-in-law are very concerned about your safety and want to make sure this property is sound." The phrasing bothered me immediately. Not concerned about the property, but concerned about my safety, as if I were some fragile elderly woman who could not be trusted to maintain my own home. I showed Dennis inside and offered to give him a tour, but he waved me off dismissively. "I have done hundreds of these assessments, ma'am. I know what to look for. Why don't you just relax and let me do my job?" There was something patronizing in his tone that set my teeth on edge, but I nodded and retreated to my kitchen where I could watch him work through the doorway. Dennis moved through the house with purpose, but I noticed he was not conducting the kind of thorough examination Robertson had performed. He did not use moisture meters or thermal imaging equipment. He did not check the electrical panel carefully or test the plumbing fixtures. Instead, he seemed to be taking photographs and making notes on his clipboard, spending more time documenting than actually inspecting. After about 90 minutes, Dennis returned to the kitchen where I was reading the newspaper and making notes of my own about his behavior. He set his clipboard down on the table with a heavy sigh that sounded rehearsed. "Mrs. Morrison, I am afraid I have some very serious concerns about this property." I set down my coffee cup and looked at him steadily. "What kind of concerns?" Dennis launched into a detailed recitation of alleged problems. The foundation had significant cracks that indicated structural settling. The roof had water damage that suggested active leaks. The electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous. The plumbing showed signs of corrosion that could lead to catastrophic failure. The HVAC system was operating beyond its safe lifespan. On and on he went, painting a picture of a house that was essentially uninhabitable and potentially dangerous. As he spoke, I felt my blood pressure rising, but I kept my expression neutral and my voice calm. "That is very concerning," I said evenly. "Can you show me specifically where you found these problems?" Dennis hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. "Of course," he said, standing up. "Let's start with the foundation." We went to the basement, and Dennis pointed to a hairline crack in the concrete wall near the water heater. "This crack indicates serious settling," he said with grave authority. "It's the kind of thing that can compromise the entire structural integrity of the house. If you don't address this immediately, you could be looking at foundation failure that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair." I looked at the crack he was indicating. It was the same hairline crack that Robertson had photographed and noted in his report as a common superficial crack related to concrete curing, cosmetic only, no structural concern. The crack had been there when David and I bought the house 32 years ago. Our home inspector then had said exactly what Robertson said now, that it was nothing to worry about. "Dennis," I said quietly, "can you explain how you determine this crack represents active settling rather than a superficial curing crack?" He blinked at me, clearly not expecting technical questions. "The pattern and depth suggest active movement," he said, his voice less certain than before. "Did you use any instruments to measure the depth or width of the crack?" I asked. "Did you check for corresponding cracks elsewhere in the foundation? Did you look for signs of door or window frame distortion that would indicate actual settling?" Dennis's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Morrison, I have been doing this for 15 years. I know a structural problem when I see one." I pulled out my phone and opened the photos from Robert Chen's report. This is the same crack photographed by a certified inspector 4 weeks ago. He documented it as cosmetic only, with no structural significance. Would you like to see his full analysis? The color began to drain from Dennis's face, but he recovered quickly. Well, sometimes these things develop rapidly. What was fine a month ago might have worsened. Concrete does not develop structural cracks in 4 weeks, I replied. Let's look at the roof damage you mentioned. We went upstairs to the attic access, and Dennis pointed to some discoloration on the wood near one of the roof vents. This is clear evidence of water infiltration, he declared. You probably have active leaks that are causing rot in the roof decking. This is a safety hazard that needs immediate attention. I took a photograph of the area he was indicating and pulled up another image from Robert Chen's report. This discoloration was photographed and analyzed last month. It's residue from condensation that occurred during a particularly humid period several years ago. The area was tested for moisture and found to be completely dry. There is no active leak and no rot. Would you like to see the moisture readings? Dennis was sweating now, and I could see him calculating his next move. Mrs. Morrison, I think you are misunderstanding the severity of these issues. Your previous inspector might have missed things, or maybe he was not as thorough as he should have been. Or maybe, I said, my voice still calm but with steel underneath it. You are not conducting an actual inspection but rather documenting false problems to serve someone else's agenda. The accusation hung in the air between us. Dennis's expression shifted from defensive to angry. I don't know what you are implying, but I am a licensed professional. If you don't want my expert opinion, then I'll just complete my report and submit it to your daughter who hired me. There it was. The confirmation that this inspection was not about the house at all, but about creating a narrative that Lauren could use for whatever purpose she had in mind. I pulled out the full copy of Robert Chen's inspection report and handed it to Dennis. You can submit whatever report you want, I said evenly, but I will be submitting this comprehensive inspection from a certified inspector to anyone who asks about the condition of my property. I will also be very interested to see if your report matches the actual condition of this house, or if it represents fraudulent misrepresentation for financial gain. Dennis stared at the report in his hands, and I watched him realize that whatever plan he had been part of was falling apart. He set the report down on the table and began gathering his equipment without another word. I think we are done here, he muttered. I followed him to the front door and watched as he loaded his equipment into his truck. As he pulled away from the curb, I noticed a silver sedan parked 3 houses down on the opposite side of the street. Even from a distance, I recognized it as Lauren's car. She had been waiting, watching, expecting to hear that her hired inspector had found exactly the problem she needed him to find. I pulled out my phone and took a photograph of her car, then walked calmly back into my house and locked the door. My hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, and I sat down at my kitchen table trying to process what had just happened. My daughter had hired someone to create a fraudulent inspection report, declaring my house unsafe. The implications were staggering. If I had not had Robert Chen's inspection to counter Dennis's claims, if I had not known enough to question his findings, I might have believed that my home was actually dangerous. And then what? Lauren would have insisted I move immediately, perhaps into one of those retirement communities she had been pushing. She would have argued that the house needed to be sold quickly, before the foundation failed or the roof collapsed. As my daughter and probably my power of attorney if I had been frightened enough to sign those documents, she could have orchestrated the entire sale, controlled the proceeds, and effectively taken everything I had. The phone rang, making me jump. Lauren's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, using those seconds to steady my voice. Hi, sweetheart, I said, as if nothing unusual had happened. Mom, how did the inspection go? Lauren's voice was bright with false cheer. Did Dennis find anything concerning? He found several things he claimed were concerning, I replied carefully. But fortunately, I had just had a very thorough inspection done last month, so I was able to compare his findings with a certified inspector's report. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean you compared them? I mean I showed Dennis Crawford the comprehensive inspection report from Robert Chen that documents the actual condition of every system in this house. Interestingly, Dennis's concerns did not match the findings from a certified inspector. In fact, Dennis seemed to be documenting problems that don't actually exist. Another silence, and I could almost hear Lauren's mind racing to recalibrate her approach. Mom, maybe this Robertson person missed things. Brett says Dennis is one of the best inspectors in the area. Brett says, I noted, not Dennis's credentials speak for themselves or I verified his qualifications, but Brett says, as if my son-in-law's opinion should override documented evidence. Lauren, I said, keeping my voice level, why did you feel it was necessary to have my house inspected when I told you I had just had it done professionally? Because we care about you, Mom. We worry about you living alone in that big house. If there are problems, we want to help you address them before something bad happens. And if this inspection had found serious problems, what would you have suggested I do? I could hear the hesitation in her breathing before she answered. Well, obviously you would need to get them fixed. But if they were as serious as Dennis seemed to think, it might make more sense to sell the house and move somewhere safer, somewhere where you would not have to worry about maintenance and repairs. There it was, delivered with such practiced concern that I might have believed it if I had not seen the manipulation for what it was. Lauren, I am not selling my house. This home is structurally sound, well-maintained, and exactly where I want to be. The inspection you arranged was not about my safety. It was about creating justification for me to leave my home so you could, what exactly? Sell it? Control the proceeds? She gasped with theatrical offense. Mom, how can you say that? I'm your daughter. Everything I do is because I love you and want what is best for you. If that were true, I said quietly, you would respect my decisions about my own life instead of trying to manipulate me into doing what you want. You would not bring me fraudulent power of attorney documents. You would not hire someone to create a false inspection report. You would not be parked down the street right now waiting to see if your plan worked. The sharp intake of breath told me my observation about her car had hit home. I'm not, she started, but I cut her off. Lauren, I can see your car from my window. I took a photograph of it. Just like I made copies of the real inspection report and the power of attorney documents you tried to pressure me into signing. I have documentation of everything, and I am not going to let you gaslight me into thinking I am incompetent or unsafe in my own home. Mom, you are being paranoid. This is exactly why we are worried about you. You are seeing conspiracies where there is just family trying to help. The classic abuser's response, I thought. Accuse the victim of being irrational for recognizing the abuse. I had seen this pattern in business dealings for years. People who got caught in dishonest behavior immediately claiming that anyone who called them out was overreacting or misunderstanding. I am going to hang up now, I said calmly. I suggest you and Brett reconsider whatever plans you have regarding my property and my life, because I am not cooperating with them. I have legal representation, documented evidence of your attempts at manipulation, and I am completely competent to manage my own affairs. If you actually care about me, you will respect my autonomy. If you don't, then we will have a very different kind of conversation with my attorney present. I hung up before she could respond and immediately called Martin Chambers. Martin listened to my account of the inspection without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. Patricia, what you are describing is elder financial abuse. It's more common than people realize, and it often comes from family members who feel entitled to their parents' assets. The fact that Lauren tried to get you to sign over power of attorney, and then arranged a fraudulent inspection suggests a coordinated effort to either take control of your finances or pressure you into decisions that benefit her financially. What can I do to protect myself? I asked, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. First, we document everything. I want copies of both inspection reports, records of all communications with Lauren about the power of attorney and the house, and any other evidence of her pressure campaign. Second, we make sure your estate planning documents are ironclad and stored securely. Third, we consider whether this situation warrants reporting to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. Martin paused before continuing. Patricia, I know this is your daughter, and I know how painful this must be. But financial abuse is a serious crime. And the pattern you are describing suggests Lauren is not going to stop unless there are consequences. I made an appointment to meet with Martin the following day, and then I did something I had been avoiding. I called my younger sister Helen, who lived in Portland and who had always gotten along better with Lauren than I did. Helen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without judging me for speaking badly about my daughter. Over the next hour, I walked Helen through everything that had happened. Unlike Lauren, Helen actually listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Patty," she finally said, using the childhood nickname only she was allowed to use, "I'm so sorry. I noticed Lauren asking me strange questions about your finances a few months ago, and I thought she was just being nosy. Now I realize she was probably trying to figure out how much you're worth." "What kind of questions?" Helen sighed. "She wanted to know if you had talked to me about retirement plans, if you had mentioned selling the house, if you seemed confused or forgetful. At the time, I told her you were sharp as ever and had no plans to go anywhere." She seemed annoyed by that answer, and I thought it was weird, but I did not connect it to anything sinister. Now I feel like an idiot for not seeing what she was doing. "You are not an idiot," I assured her. "She's my daughter." And even I did not want to see it until the evidence was overwhelming. Helen and I talked for another hour, and by the end of the conversation I felt less alone than I had in months. She promised to document any future conversations with Lauren, and to serve as a witness if needed. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. My daughter, the baby I had carried and birthed and raised, the child I had sacrificed for and worried over and loved unconditionally, was trying to steal my home and my independence. The grief was almost physical, a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. But underneath the grief was something else. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, determined anger that comes from being underestimated and betrayed. Lauren had made the mistake of thinking I was weak, that age had made me vulnerable and easy to manipulate. She had forgotten that I had built a career in sales by reading people, by understanding motivation, by recognizing manipulation and countering it with strategy. She had forgotten that I was not just her mother, but a woman who had survived grief and rebuilt her life and learned to trust her own judgment. The next morning, I met with Martin Chambers and gave him copies of everything. Robert Chin's inspection report, Dennis Crawford's business card and contact information, the power of attorney documents Lauren had brought, printouts of text messages where she pressured me about moving, even the photograph of her car parked down the street during the fraudulent inspection. Martin spread everything across his conference table and studied it with the same care he gave to million-dollar contracts. "This is substantial," he said finally. "We have clear evidence of attempted fraud, and depending on Dennis Crawford's involvement, we might have conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I want to hire an investigator to look into Crawford's business and his connection to Brett. I also want to contact the state licensing board about his inspection practices. Do you think Lauren will back off now that she knows I am onto her?" I asked. Martin shook his head slowly. "In my experience, people who attempt this kind of financial abuse rarely stop unless forced. They have convinced themselves they are entitled to their target's assets, and they view any resistance as temporary or irrational. Lauren will likely try a different approach, maybe claim you are having memory problems or decision-making difficulties. She might try to get a doctor to declare you incompetent. We need to be prepared for escalation." His words proved prophetic within days. That Friday, Lauren showed up at my house unannounced with a woman she introduced as Dr. Susan Palmer, a geriatric psychiatrist. "Mom, Dr. Palmer has agreed to do a cognitive assessment, just to make sure everything is okay," Lauren said with that same false brightness that had become her default tone with me. "After our conversation earlier this week, Brett and I are really concerned about your mental state." I stood in my doorway, blocking their entry, and looked directly at Dr. Palmer. "Did my daughter tell you that I have not requested a cognitive assessment, that I have not given permission for any psychiatric evaluation, and that I have my own physicians who monitor my health?" Dr. Palmer looked uncomfortable, glancing between Lauren and me. "Mrs. Morrison, your daughter expressed concerns about possible early dementia symptoms. As a professional, I felt it was important to at least meet with you and discuss." "I understand you have a professional obligation," I replied, keeping my voice courteous but firm. "However, I am a competent adult with legal representation, and I do not consent to any evaluation. If my daughter has concerns about my mental capacity, she is welcome to express them to my attorney, Martin Chambers, who can provide her with documentation of my complete competence." Lauren's face reddened with anger she could no longer hide. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You're being paranoid and hostile, which are both signs of cognitive decline. Refusing help when family is concerned is a classic indicator of dementia." "No," I said calmly. "Refusing manipulation when family is trying to steal my assets is a classic indicator of good judgment. Dr. Palmer, I suggest you verify the legitimacy of this request before you involve yourself in what amounts to attempted financial abuse of a senior citizen. Dr. Palmer took a step back from both of us. Mrs. Holloway, I think perhaps this is a matter you should discuss with your mother's physician directly. I'm not comfortable proceeding without proper consent and documentation. Lauren watched Dr. Palmer retreat to her car with an expression of fury that made her look like a stranger. When she turned back to me, the mask of concerned daughter was completely gone. You are going to regret this, she hissed. That house should be mine. Dad would have wanted me to have it, and you are being selfish hanging on to it when you're obviously not capable of maintaining it properly. Your father, I said quietly, left the house to me because he trusted me to make my own decisions about it. He never suggested you were entitled to inherit while I was still alive. If you believe you have some legal claim to this property, I suggest you discuss it with your attorney, because this conversation is over. I closed the door in her face and locked it, then watched through the window as she stormed to her car. I was shaking again, but this time it was more from adrenaline than fear. I immediately called Martin and recounted the attempted psychiatric evaluation. He was furious in his measured attorney way. Patricia, this is escalation exactly as I predicted. Lauren is now attempting to create a medical basis for declaring you incompetent. We need to act proactively. I want you to undergo a comprehensive cognitive evaluation with a neurologist of our choosing, someone who has no connection to Lauren and who can provide documentation of your mental capacity. I want updated medical records from all your physicians. And I want to file a cease and desist letter warning Lauren that any further attempts at harassment, manipulation, or fraudulent claims about your competency will result in legal action. We did all of that over the following 2 weeks. I saw Dr. Raymond Foster, a respected neuropsychologist who put me through 3 hours of cognitive testing that was genuinely challenging. When the results came back, Dr. Foster smiled and handed me a report that documented cognitive function in the superior range for my age group, with particular strengths in executive function, problem-solving, and decision-making capacity. Mrs. Morrison, he said, you have the mental acuity of someone 20 years younger. There is absolutely no evidence of any cognitive decline, dementia, or impairment of judgment. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either incompetent or dishonest. I had copies of Dr. Foster's evaluation sent to Martin, to my primary care physician, and kept in my safe deposit box. Martin sent the cease and desist letter to Lauren via certified mail, documenting every attempt she had made to manipulate or control me, and warning that further harassment would result in a restraining order and potential criminal charges for attempted elder abuse. For 2 weeks there was silence. No phone calls, no visits, no attempts at contact. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt like I was waiting for another shoe to drop. It dropped on a Wednesday afternoon when my neighbor Margaret Chun knocked on my door looking worried. Patricia, she said, I just wanted you to know that a man was taking photographs of your house this morning. He had professional camera equipment, and he spent about 30 minutes walking around your property and shooting pictures from different angles. I asked if he was from the township or the insurance company, and he said he was doing a property assessment for potential buyers. Margaret's husband Robert had done my legitimate inspection, so she knew the full story of what had been happening with Lauren. Did he say who hired him? I asked. He said he was not at liberty to discuss client information, but he gave me his business card. Margaret handed me the card. Thomas Wu, Property Documentation Services. I thanked Margaret and immediately called Martin, who requested that I send him the business card information. Within an hour, his investigator had determined that Thomas Wu frequently worked with commercial real estate developers doing property assessments for acquisition purposes. Brett Holloway's name appeared in several joint projects with the firm Thomas Wu worked for. They are building a case for forced sale, Martin explained when he called me back. If they can document enough alleged problems with your property through fraudulent inspections, and if they can create enough concern about your ability to maintain it, they could potentially petition for guardianship claiming you are a vulnerable adult who cannot safely manage your own affairs. With guardianship, they would have legal authority to sell your home against your wishes. Can they actually do that? I asked, feeling ice spread through my veins. It is difficult but not impossible, especially if they can find a sympathetic judge, and present a compelling narrative of a declining elderly woman living in a deteriorating house. The fact that we have documentation of your perfect cognitive function and the house's excellent condition will make their case very difficult, but we should assume they are going to try. What do? We file first, Martin said grimly. We're going to seek a protective order against Lauren and Brett, based on attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. We're going to report Dennis Crawford to the State Licensing Board for fraudulent inspection practices. We're going to document everything they have done and create a legal record that will make it impossible for them to claim they were acting in your best interests. And I think you need to seriously consider changing your will to make it clear that Lauren's behavior has consequences. The thought of writing my daughter out of my will was painful beyond words, but Martin was right. If Lauren was willing to go this far while I was alive, what would she do after I was gone? I scheduled an appointment to update my estate planning documents. 2 days later, Lauren called me from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, her voice was cold and businesslike, nothing like the daughter I had raised. Mom, we need to talk about the future. Brett and I have been consulting with attorneys, and we believe it is in everyone's best interests if you agree to sell the house voluntarily. We've already identified several excellent retirement communities, and we can help you transition smoothly if you cooperate. And if I refuse, then we will have to pursue other options. Mom, you need to understand that we are trying to help you. If you force us to go to court to protect you from yourself, it's going to be expensive and embarrassing for everyone. The courts tend to side with family members who are genuinely concerned about elderly parents. I let her finish, and then I spoke with perfect calm. Lauren, you should know that I have retained legal counsel who has documented every attempt you have made to manipulate, defraud, or coerce me over the past 6 months. I have comprehensive cognitive evaluations proving I am perfectly competent. I have inspection reports proving my house is in excellent condition. I have evidence of your conspiracy with fraudulent inspectors and property assessors. If you attempt to pursue guardianship or any other legal action against me, I will not only defend myself vigorously, I will countersue for attempted elder abuse and financial exploitation. Additionally, my will has been updated to reflect your behavior, and you should be aware that any further harassment will have serious consequences for your inheritance. There was shocked silence on the other end of the line. You would not, she finally said. I already have, I replied. Lauren, I loved you unconditionally for 34 years. I would have given you anything you needed. But you chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty, and betrayal over family. Those choices have consequences, and you're about to learn what they are. I hung up and blocked her number. Within hours, Martin received a furious call from Lauren's attorney threatening litigation. Martin calmly explained that we welcomed her attempt to prove in court that a woman with superior cognitive function and a perfectly maintained home needed a guardian, and that we would be filing counterclaims for elder abuse, harassment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We would also be seeking sanctions against any attorney who participated in frivolous guardianship proceedings designed to facilitate financial exploitation. Lauren's attorney withdrew from representation the next day. The State Licensing Board opened an investigation into Dennis Crawford's inspection practices after Martin provided them with evidence that Crawford had created fraudulent reports for multiple properties where family members were attempting to force elderly homeowners into selling. Crawford's license was suspended pending the investigation. Thomas Wu's Property Documentation Services received a cease and desist letter warning that any further trespass on my property or harassment of me or my neighbors would result in criminal complaints and civil action. For weeks I waited for the next move, but none came. Lauren had finally realized that her target was not the confused, vulnerable elderly woman she had imagined, but a competent, legally represented person who was fighting back with documentation, evidence, and professional support. She had underestimated me completely, and that miscalculation had cost her everything she had been trying to steal, and potentially her entire inheritance. 3 months later, I sat in Martin's office finalizing my updated will and estate plan. The document was clear and specific about why Lauren was receiving only the minimum required by law, rather than the generous inheritance I had originally planned. It documented her attempts at manipulation, fraud, and exploitation, creating a legal record that would be difficult for her to challenge. Martin, I said as we finished the paperwork, Part of me still can't believe my own daughter did this. How do parents protect themselves from their own children? Martin had seen enough estate battles to have strong opinions on the subject. Education and documentation, he said firmly. People need to understand that elder financial abuse is common, that it often comes from family members, and that protecting yourself is not paranoid or suspicious, it's practical. Trust but verify. Love your children but maintain your independence. Be generous but protect your assets. And document everything, because the truth is your best defense against manipulation. I left Martin's office feeling a strange sense of peace. I had fought for my independence and won. The house that David and I built our life in remained mine. My finances remained under my control, and my future remained my choice. Lauren had tried to take all of that and she had failed. That evening I sat on my porch watching the sunset and thinking about the difference between the family I had hoped for and the reality I had discovered. Lauren was not the daughter I had raised, or perhaps she was exactly the daughter I had raised and I had just refused to see the selfishness and entitlement that had always been there. Either way, our relationship was over, not because I chose to end it, but because she had destroyed it with her choices. But I was not alone. Helen called me weekly. Margaret and Robertson had become close friends. Martin Chambers had proved that loyalty and integrity still existed in the world. I had built a new life based on truth rather than denial, independence rather than dependence, and chosen relationships rather than obligatory ones. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I recognized the tone immediately. It was Lauren, using yet another number I had not blocked. Mom, please. We need to talk. I made mistakes, but I'm your daughter. Family is supposed to forgive. I stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about what forgiveness meant. Could I forgive Lauren for trying to steal my home and independence? Perhaps eventually. But forgiveness did not require reconciliation. Forgiveness did not mean trusting someone who had proved themselves untrustworthy. Forgiveness did not mean giving another chance to someone who had squandered every chance before. I deleted the message without responding and blocked the new number. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in the home I had fought to keep, and celebrated the victory of truth over manipulation, independence over control, and self-respect over obligatory family loyalty. At 58, I had learned that the most important relationship I could protect was the one with myself. The legal battles that followed my confrontation with Lauren consumed the next several months of my life in ways I had never anticipated. What I thought would be a simple matter of protecting my property and independence became a complex web of depositions, court filings, and strategic maneuvering that tested every ounce of strength I possessed. Martin Chambers had warned me that once we filed the protective order against Lauren and Brett, they would likely respond with aggression rather than retreat, and he was absolutely correct. Within 2 weeks of our initial filing, Lauren's new attorney, a man named Gregory Ashford who specialized in what he euphemistically called family wealth transition disputes, filed a counterpetition claiming that I was exhibiting signs of paranoid delusions and was making irrational decisions based on unfounded suspicions of family members who only wanted to help me. The petition was 23 pages of carefully worded lies and distortions that painted me as a confused elderly woman who had become hostile toward loving family members for no rational reason. It cited my refusal to sign the power of attorney documents as evidence of impaired judgment, my rejection of the home inspection as proof of denial about my deteriorating living conditions, and my accusations against Lauren as symptoms of paranoid thinking common in early dementia. Reading that document felt like being punched in the stomach. Every act of self-protection I had taken was being reframed as evidence of incompetence. Every boundary I had set was being presented as irrational hostility. The woman described in that petition bore no resemblance to who I actually was, but I could see how convincing the narrative might be to someone who did not know the full context. Gregory Ashford was skilled at taking facts and twisting them just enough to create a completely different story. Martin responded with our own filing that was equally detailed but based entirely on documented evidence rather than interpretation. We included Dr. Raymond Foster's comprehensive cognitive evaluation showing superior mental function. We included Robert Chin's thorough inspection report proving the house was in excellent condition. We included the cease and desist letter we had sent to Dennis Crawford and the state licensing board's investigation into his fraudulent practices. We included copies of the overly broad power of attorney documents Lauren, had tried to pressure me into signing. We included Helen's affidavit describing Lauren's suspicious questions about my finances and mental state. We included Margaret Chen's statement about Thomas Wu photographing my property without permission. Every claim in Lauren's petition was countered with objective evidence proving it false. The contrast between their narrative-based accusations and our evidence-based defense was stark, and Martin felt confident that no reasonable judge would side with Lauren once they reviewed the actual facts. But family law is complicated, and judges have wide discretion in cases involving elderly parents and concerned adult children. So nothing was guaranteed. The first hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early November. I arrived at the courthouse with Martin, dressed professionally in a navy suit that I hoped projected competence and capability rather than vulnerable elderly woman in need of protection. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. Lauren and Brett were already seated at the opposing table with Gregory Ashford, and this was the first time I had seen my daughter in person since she had tried to bring the psychiatrist to my house. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face drawn with stress or perhaps guilt, though I suspected it was more likely frustration that her plans had been thwarted. Brett sat beside her with his characteristic expression of smug entitlement, as if he were merely tolerating an annoying formality before getting what he deserved. When our eyes met, Lauren looked away quickly, but Brett stared at me with open hostility that was almost startling in its intensity. Judge Catherine Brennan entered the courtroom and we all stood. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had seen every variation of family dispute and had little patience for manipulation or theatrics. She reviewed the case files in silence for several minutes while we all waited, and I found myself studying her face for any indication of how she was interpreting the competing narratives before her. When she finally looked up, her expression was carefully neutral. "This is a petition for guardianship and conservatorship over Patricia Morrison, filed by her daughter Lauren Holloway," Judge Brennan began. "Mrs. Holloway claims that her mother is suffering from cognitive decline that impairs her judgment and makes her vulnerable to financial exploitation and unsafe living conditions. Mrs. Morrison contests this claim and has filed evidence suggesting that the guardianship petition is itself an attempt at financial exploitation. Is that an accurate summary?" Both attorneys confirmed it was, and Judge Brennan continued. "I have reviewed the initial filings from both parties, and I have some serious concerns about the evidence presented by the petitioner. Mr. Ashford, your client's petition relies heavily on Mrs. Morrison's refusal to sign broad power of attorney documents and her rejection of a home inspection that she claims was fraudulent. However, Mrs. Morrison has provided evidence that she underwent a different home inspection just weeks before the one your client arranged, and that inspection found the property to be in excellent condition. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Gregory Ashford stood with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, our position is that Mrs. Morrison's first inspection was inadequate and failed to identify serious problems that the second inspector found. Mrs. Morrison's refusal to acknowledge these problems and her hostile reaction to family members who were trying to help her address them are consistent with the kind of denial and paranoia that often accompany early cognitive decline." Judge Brennan looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ashford, I have here a report from the State Licensing Board indicating that Dennis Crawford, the inspector your client hired, is currently under investigation for creating fraudulent inspection reports in multiple cases involving family members attempting to pressure elderly homeowners into selling their properties. Are you aware of this investigation?" The color drained slightly from Ashford's face, and I saw him glance quickly at Lauren, who was staring at her hands. "Your Honor, I was not aware of any investigation. My client assured me that Mr. Crawford was a reputable professional." "That may be what your client told you," Judge Brennan replied, "but the evidence suggests otherwise. I also have here a comprehensive cognitive evaluation from Dr. Raymond Foster, a board-certified neuropsychologist with over 30 years of experience, documenting that Mrs. Morrison's cognitive function is not only normal but superior for her age group. Do you have any medical evidence that contradicts Dr. Foster's evaluation?" Ashford shuffled through his papers. "We have concerns expressed by family members about Mrs. Morrison's behavior, Your Honor. Her increasing hostility and paranoia, her refusal to accept help, her irrational accusations against family members who only want to assist her." Those are not medical evidence, Mr. Ashford. Those are characterizations. Do you have any actual medical documentation of cognitive impairment? We were in the process of arranging for a psychiatric evaluation when Mrs. Morrison refused to cooperate, which itself is indicative of impaired judgment. Judge Brennan's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Ashford, refusing to submit to a psychiatric evaluation arranged by family members who are attempting to take control of your assets is not evidence of impaired judgment. It is evidence of appropriate self-protection. Unless you have actual medical evidence of cognitive decline, I am not inclined to give weight to your client's interpretations of her mother's behavior. Martin stood to present our case, and his calm professionalism was a stark contrast to Ashford's increasingly defensive posture. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Morrison is a competent adult who has been the target of a coordinated campaign by her daughter and son-in-law to force her out of her home and gain control of her assets. We have documentation of attempts to pressure her into signing an overly broad power of attorney that would have given her daughter immediate and complete control over her finances and medical decisions. We have evidence of a fraudulent home inspection designed to create false justification for declaring her home unsafe. We have witness statements describing suspicious inquiries about Mrs. Morrison's mental state and finances. And we have Mrs. Morrison's own testimony, which I believe Your Honor will find to be articulate, rational, and completely consistent with someone exercising appropriate judgment to protect herself from financial exploitation. Judge Brennan listened carefully and then addressed me directly. Mrs. Morrison, I would like to hear from you about why you believe your daughter filed this guardianship petition. I stood, and despite the butterflies in my stomach, my voice came out steady and clear. Your Honor, 6 months ago, my daughter began pressuring me to sign power of attorney documents that would have given her complete control over my life, while I am still healthy and competent. When I refused and sought legal advice about those documents, she began a campaign to create the appearance that I was incompetent and that my home was unsafe. She hired an inspector who claimed to find serious structural problems that did not exist. She tried to bring a psychiatrist to my home without my consent to perform an evaluation I had not requested. She had property assessors photograph my home without permission as if it were for sale. Every action she has taken has been designed to force me out of my home and transfer my assets to her control. This is not about my safety or well-being. This is about my daughter believing she is entitled to my property before I am even dead. The bluntness of my statement seemed to surprise everyone in the courtroom, including Lauren, who flinched visibly. Judge Brennan studied me carefully. Mrs. Morrison, do you believe your daughter loves you? I paused, considering the question honestly. I believe my daughter loves the idea of me, or perhaps the version of me that exists to serve her needs. But the person who would hire fraudulent inspectors to deceive me, who would try to trick me into signing away my independence, who would attempt to have me declared incompetent when I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, that person does not love me in any meaningful sense of the word. That person views me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be cherished. The courtroom was silent for a moment after my response, and I saw Judge Brennan nod almost imperceptibly. She asked me several more questions about my daily life, my ability to manage my finances, my social connections, and my understanding of the legal proceedings. I answered each question clearly and specifically, providing details that demonstrated not just competence but engaged, active participation in my own life. When she finished, Judge Brennan turned to Lauren. Mrs. Holloway, I would like to hear directly from you about why you believe your mother needs a guardian. Lauren stood, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. Your Honor, my mother has become increasingly isolated and paranoid over the past year. She refuses to listen to reason about the condition of her house. She makes accusations against me and my husband that are completely unfounded. I am worried about her living alone in that big house, and I thought that having legal authority to help her would protect her from making poor decisions or being taken advantage of by strangers. Judge Brennan's expression was skeptical. Mrs. Holloway, the evidence suggests that your mother is not isolated. She has friends, family members who support her, and professional advisors. The only people she has distanced herself from are you and your husband. Can you explain why that might be? Lauren's face reddened. Because she has become paranoid and hostile toward family members who are trying to help her. That is a characterization, Not an explanation, Judge Brennan replied. Let me ask you specifically about the power of attorney documents you brought to your mother. Why did those documents give you immediate and complete control rather than being limited in scope or activated only upon her incapacity? Lauren hesitated, searching for an answer that would not sound damning. My attorney recommended that structure to avoid delays if something happened suddenly. Your attorney recommended that you obtain complete control over your competent mother's life and assets immediately? That strikes me as unusual legal advice. Can you explain what specific circumstances would justify such broad authority? Lauren looked at Gregory Ashford desperately, but he remained silent, apparently recognizing that anything he said would only make things worse. Your Honor, I was just trying to be prepared for any emergency. And the home inspection you arranged, Judge Brennan continued. Can you explain why you hired Dennis Crawford specifically, and whether you knew about his history of providing fraudulent reports? I did not know about any investigation, Lauren insisted. My husband recommended him as someone who does thorough inspections. Your husband Brett Holloway works in commercial real estate, correct? Yes, Your Honor. And he has professional connections to property developers and assessment services? Yes, but I do not see what that has to do with anything. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Holloway, it seems quite relevant when your husband, who works in real estate development, recommends an inspector who finds serious problems that a certified inspector found no evidence of just weeks earlier, and that inspector is now under investigation for creating fraudulent reports in cases involving family members trying to force property sales. Can you see how that pattern might look like a coordinated effort to manipulate your mother into selling her home? Lauren's composure cracked completely. Your Honor, that house should be mine someday anyway. My father worked his whole life to pay for it, and my mother is just being stubborn about holding on to it when she could live somewhere easier and safer. The moment the words left her mouth, I saw Lauren realize her mistake. Judge Martin stood to present our case, and his calm professionalism was a stark contrast to Ashford's increasingly defensive posture. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Morrison is a competent adult who has been the target of a coordinated campaign by her daughter and son-in-law to force her out of her home and gain control of her assets. We have documentation of attempts to pressure her into signing an overly broad power of attorney that would have given her daughter immediate and complete control over her finances and medical decisions. We have evidence of a fraudulent home inspection designed to create false justification for declaring her home unsafe. We have witness statements describing suspicious inquiries about Mrs. Morrison's mental state and finances. And we have Mrs. Morrison's own testimony, which I believe Your Honor will find to be articulate, rational, and completely consistent with someone exercising appropriate judgment to protect herself from financial exploitation. Judge Brennan listened carefully and then addressed me directly. Mrs. Morrison, I would like to hear from you about why you believe your daughter filed this guardianship petition. I stood, and despite the butterflies in my stomach, my voice came out steady and clear. Your Honor, 6 months ago, my daughter began pressuring me to sign power of attorney documents that would have given her complete control over my life, while I am still healthy and competent. When I refused and sought legal advice about those documents, she began a campaign to create the appearance that I was incompetent and that my home was unsafe. She hired an inspector who claimed to find serious structural problems that did not exist. She tried to bring a psychiatrist to my home without my consent to perform an evaluation I had not requested. She had property assessors photograph my home without permission as if it were for sale. Every action she has taken has been designed to force me out of my home and transfer my assets to her control. This is not about my safety or well-being. This is about my daughter believing she is entitled to my property before I am even dead. The bluntness of my statement seemed to surprise everyone in the courtroom, including Lauren, who flinched visibly. Judge Brennan studied me carefully. Mrs. Morrison, do you believe your daughter loves you? I paused, considering the question honestly. I believe my daughter loves the idea of me, or perhaps the version of me that exists to serve her needs. But the person who would hire fraudulent inspectors to deceive me, who would try to trick me into signing away my independence, who would attempt to have me declared incompetent when I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, that person does not love me in any meaningful sense of the word. That person views me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be cherished. The courtroom was silent for a moment after my response, And I saw Judge Brennan nod almost imperceptibly. She asked me several more questions about my daily life, my ability to manage my finances, my social connections, and my understanding of the legal proceedings. I answered each question clearly and specifically, providing details that demonstrated not just competence but engaged, active participation in my own life. When she finished, Judge Brennan turned to Lauren. "Mrs. Holloway, I would like to hear directly from you about why you believe your mother needs a guardian." Lauren stood, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. "Your Honor, my mother has become increasingly isolated and paranoid over the past year. She refuses to listen to reason about the condition of her house. She makes accusations against me and my husband that are completely unfounded. I am worried about her living alone in that big house, and I thought that having legal authority to help her would protect her from making poor decisions or being taken advantage of by strangers." Judge Brennan's expression was skeptical. "Mrs. Holloway, the evidence suggests that your mother is not isolated. She has friends, family members who support her, and professional advisors. The only people she has distanced herself from are you and your husband. Can you explain why that might be?" Lauren's face reddened. "Because she has become paranoid and hostile toward family members who are trying to help her." "That is a characterization, not an explanation," Judge Brennan replied. "Let me ask you specifically about the power of attorney documents you brought to your mother. Why did those documents give you immediate and complete control rather than being limited in scope or activated only upon her incapacity?" Lauren hesitated, searching for an answer that would not sound damning. "My attorney recommended that structure to avoid delays if something happened suddenly." "Your attorney recommended that you obtain complete control over your competent mother's life and assets immediately? That strikes me as unusual legal advice. Can you explain what specific circumstances would justify such broad authority?" Lauren looked at Gregory Ashford desperately, but he remained silent, apparently recognizing that anything he said would only make things worse. "Your Honor, I was just trying to be prepared for any emergency." "And the home inspection you arranged," Judge Brennan continued. "Can you explain why you hired Dennis Crawford specifically, and whether you knew about his history of providing fraudulent reports?" "I did not know about any investigation," Lauren insisted. "My husband recommended him as someone who does thorough inspections." "Your husband Brett Holloway works in commercial real estate, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And he has professional connections to property developers and assessment services?" "Yes, but I do not see what that has to do with anything." Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Holloway, it seems quite relevant when your husband, who works in real estate development, recommends an inspector who finds serious problems that a certified inspector found no evidence of just weeks earlier, and that inspector is now under investigation for creating fraudulent reports in cases involving family members trying to force property sales. Can you see how that pattern might look like a coordinated effort to manipulate your mother into selling her home?" Lauren's composure cracked completely. "Your Honor, that house should be mine someday anyway. My father worked his whole life to pay for it, and my mother is just being stubborn about holding on to it when she could live somewhere easier and safer." The moment the words left her mouth, I saw Lauren realize her mistake. Judge, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had spent 20 years working in elder protection and had seen every variation of family financial abuse. Sandra came to my home on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 3 hours interviewing me, reviewing my financial records, examining Martin's billing statements, and asking detailed questions about my decision-making process regarding my will and estate planning. I walked her through everything that had happened with Lauren, showed her the evidence we had compiled, and explained how Martin had protected rather than exploited me. Sandra listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that I take all complaints seriously, but it is immediately clear to me that this complaint is retaliatory rather than legitimate. Your financial records show no unusual transactions, your attorney's fees are reasonable and properly documented, and your decision-making regarding your estate is entirely rational and well justified, given your daughter's behavior. I will be closing this investigation with a finding of no abuse and recommending that your daughter face consequences for filing a false report." The relief was enormous, but Sandra was not finished. "Mrs. Morrison, I also want you to know that what your daughter attempted is more common than people realize. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets will sometimes pursue multiple strategies simultaneously, hoping that one of them will succeed. Guardianship petitions, psychiatric evaluations, APS complaints, challenges to estate planning documents. These are all tools that can be weaponized by people who prioritize inheritance over relationship. The fact that you recognize the manipulation and protected yourself is remarkable, because many victims do not realize what is happening until it is too late. Have you seen many cases like mine? I asked. More than I wish I had, Sandra replied. The difficult truth is that elder financial abuse is often perpetrated by family members, and it is particularly hard to combat because victims are reluctant to believe that their own children would harm them. You did everything right. You documented evidence, you sought legal counsel, you trusted your instincts when something felt wrong. Those actions saved your independence and possibly your life, because once someone gains complete control over an elderly person's finances and medical decisions, the potential for abuse escalates dramatically. After Sandra left, I sat in my kitchen and thought about how close I had come to losing everything. If I had signed those power of attorney documents out of misplaced trust in my daughter, if I had not had Robert Chen's inspection to compare against Dennis Crawford's fraudulent report, if I had not been educated enough about legal documents to question what I was being asked to sign, Lauren might have succeeded. I might be living in some sterile retirement community right now while she sold my house and spent my money, all under legal authority I had unknowingly granted her. The thought made me physically ill. The district attorney's investigation moved slowly, as these things apparently do, but 6 months after Judge Brennan's ruling, formal charges were filed against both Lauren and Brett. Lauren was charged with attempted fraud, filing false legal documents, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Brett was charged as a co-conspirator, and with subordination of fraudulent business practices for his role in connecting Lauren with Dennis Crawford and Thomas Wu. Dennis Crawford faced his own charges related to the fraudulent inspection reports he had created for multiple clients. The arraignment was scheduled for a morning in late spring, and Martin asked if I wanted to attend. I debated with myself for days about whether seeing Lauren in court again would provide closure, or just reopen wounds that were slowly beginning to heal. Ultimately, I decided to go, not because I wanted to gloat or hurt her further, but because I needed to see this chapter reach its conclusion. I needed to witness the moment when consequences arrived for actions that could have destroyed my life. The courtroom was different from the one where Judge Brennan had heard the guardianship case, larger and more formal, with the kind of institutional gravity that comes from handling criminal matters rather than civil disputes. Lauren and Brett sat at the defense table with their new attorney, a public defender named Michael Torres who looked too young to be handling cases this serious. When Lauren saw me in the gallery, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, shame, anger, resentment, settling finally on something that looked like defeat. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Rachel Kim, was a compact woman with glasses and an air of thorough competence. She presented the charges clearly and methodically, outlining the evidence of Lauren and Brett's scheme to fraudulently gain control of my assets through manufactured claims of my incompetence and my home's deterioration. The attempted fraud charges carry penalties of up to 5 years in prison, Ms. Kim explained to the judge. The conspiracy to commit elder abuse charges carry additional penalties of up to 3 years. Given the deliberate and premeditated nature of the defendant's actions, and the vulnerability of their intended victim, the state believes these charges are entirely appropriate and intends to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. Michael Torres stood to respond, and I could see him struggling to find a defense strategy that would not require him to argue facts that were thoroughly documented. Your Honor, my clients acknowledge that there were misunderstandings and poor decisions made in their attempts to help Mrs. Morrison. However, we believe that criminal charges are excessive given that no actual financial harm occurred, and that my client's intentions, however misguided, were rooted in genuine concern for a family member. Judge William Patterson, an older man with a deeply lined face that suggested he had heard every excuse and justification imaginable, looked at Torres with something close to pity. Mr. Torres, the evidence I have reviewed suggests that your clients engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud and manipulation, designed to strip a competent woman of her autonomy and assets. The fact that they were unsuccessful due to Mrs. Morrison's vigilance does not mitigate the seriousness of their attempt. Attempted fraud is still fraud even when it fails. Furthermore, the vulnerability of the intended victim makes this a particularly egregious offense. These are not excessive charges. They are appropriate charges for the conduct alleged. Torres tried again. Your Honor, we would like to request that my clients be allowed to enter a plea agreement in exchange for reduced charges and probation, rather than incarceration. They have no prior criminal records, they have stable employment, and Mrs. Holloway has expressed genuine remorse for the pain her actions caused her mother. Judge Patterson turned to Rachel Kim. What is the state's position on a plea agreement? Ms. Kim's expression was firm. Your Honor, the state is willing to consider a plea agreement only if the defendants plead guilty to all charges, agree to complete restitution for Mrs. Morrison's legal fees and expenses, perform substantial community service related to elder abuse prevention, and accept a suspended sentence with the understanding that any future contact with Mrs. Morrison, or any similar conduct would result in immediate incarceration. We are not willing to reduce the charges, because the conduct warrants the serious legal response these charges represent. Lauren's attorney asked for time to consult with his clients, and I watched as the three of them huddled together at the defense table, having a whispered conversation punctuated by Lauren's occasional gestures of frustration. After 10 minutes, Torres stood again. Your Honor, my clients are willing to accept the plea agreement as outlined by the prosecutor. Judge Patterson nodded. Very well. The defendants will return in 2 weeks for formal plea entry and sentencing. In the meantime, the protective order against contact with Mrs. Morrison remains in full effect. As the hearing concluded and Lauren was led out of the courtroom, she turned to look at me one more time. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw in her face something I had never seen before: recognition that she had genuinely lost. Not just the case, not just her expected inheritance, but the relationship itself. Whatever bond had existed between mother and daughter had been severed by her choices, and that severance was permanent. I felt nothing in that moment except a quiet sense of completion. 2 weeks later, I returned to court for the plea and sentencing hearing. This time I brought Helen with me for support, and we sat together in the gallery watching as Lauren and Brett formally entered guilty pleas to all charges. Judge Patterson accepted the pleas and moved directly to sentencing. Lauren Holloway and Brett Holloway, you have pleaded guilty to attempted fraud, filing false legal documents, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse against Patricia Morrison. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of family trust, and the protection society owes to its vulnerable members. While I acknowledge that you have no prior criminal records, I cannot overlook the calculated and deliberate nature of your actions. You spent months planning and executing a scheme to deprive a competent woman of her autonomy and property. You recruited professionals to participate in your fraud. You attempted to manipulate the legal system into giving you authority you had not earned and did not deserve. The fact that you were unsuccessful does not diminish the gravity of your attempt. Judge Patterson paused and looked directly at Lauren. Mrs. Holloway, what you did to your mother is particularly reprehensible, because it exploited the trust that should exist between parent and child. Your mother loved you, supported you, and planned to leave you a generous inheritance. Rather than wait for that natural inheritance and maintain a loving relationship, you chose greed and betrayal. You have destroyed your family for money you will never receive. And you have forfeited not only your inheritance but your relationship with your mother. I hope that in the years to come, you will reflect on whether that trade was worth it. He turned to Brett. Mr. Holloway, you enabled and encouraged your wife's betrayal of her mother. Your professional connections were instrumental in recruiting fraudulent inspectors and property assessors. Your influence pushed what might have been merely a difficult family dynamic into criminal conduct. You too must face the consequences of those choices. The sentences Judge Patterson imposed were substantial even with the plea agreement. Lauren and Brett each received 5-year suspended sentences, meaning they would not serve time immediately, but any violation of their probation conditions would result in incarceration. They were ordered to pay my complete legal fees and expenses, which totaled over $60,000. They were each required to complete 500 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that protect elderly people from abuse. And the protective order was made permanent, meaning they could never contact me again for any reason without facing immediate criminal consequences. As the final gavel fell and the hearing concluded, I felt Helen take my hand and squeeze it supportively. "It's really over," she whispered. "Yes," I replied. "It's really over." But even as I said the words, I knew that the emotional aftermath would take much longer to process than the legal case had taken to resolve. The following months brought a strange kind of peace mixed with occasional waves of grief that would hit me without warning. I would be working in my garden, the garden that I had fought so hard to keep, and suddenly find myself crying for the daughter I thought I had, the relationship I thought we shared, the future I had imagined where we would grow closer as I aged rather than becoming adversaries in a courtroom. Helen reminded me during one of these grief episodes that I was not mourning the loss of Lauren, but rather the loss of my illusions about who Lauren actually was. "You are grieving the death of a relationship that never really existed," she said gently. "The daughter you thought you had, who would cherish you and protect you and value your well-being over money, that daughter was always a fiction you created, because you wanted to believe the best of your child. The real Lauren, the one who..." Torres, the evidence I have reviewed suggests that your clients engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud and manipulation, designed to strip a competent woman of her autonomy and assets. The fact that they were unsuccessful due to Mrs. Morrison's vigilance does not mitigate the seriousness of their attempt. Attempted fraud is still fraud even when it fails. Furthermore, the vulnerability of the intended victim makes this a particularly egregious offense. These are not excessive charges. They are appropriate charges for the conduct alleged. Torres tried again. "Your Honor, we would like to request that my clients be allowed to enter a plea agreement in exchange for reduced charges and probation, rather than incarceration. They have no prior criminal records, they have stable employment, and Mrs. Holloway has expressed genuine remorse for the pain her actions caused her mother." Judge Patterson turned to Rachel Kim. "What is the state's position on a plea agreement?" Ms. Kim's expression was firm. "Your Honor, the state is willing to consider a plea agreement only if the defendants plead guilty to all charges, agree to complete restitution for Mrs. Morrison's legal fees and expenses, perform substantial community service related to elder abuse prevention, and accept a suspended sentence with the understanding that any future contact with Mrs. Morrison, or any similar conduct would result in immediate incarceration. We are not willing to reduce the charges, because the conduct warrants the serious legal response these charges represent." Lauren's attorney asked for time to consult with his clients, and I watched as the three of them huddled together at the defense table, having a whispered conversation punctuated by Lauren's occasional gestures of frustration. After 10 minutes, Torres stood again. "Your Honor, my clients are willing to accept the plea agreement as outlined by the prosecutor." Judge Patterson nodded. "Very well. The defendants will return in 2 weeks for formal plea entry and sentencing. In the meantime, the protective order against contact with Mrs. Morrison remains in full effect." As the hearing concluded and Lauren was led out of the courtroom, she turned to look at me one more time. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw in her face something I had never seen before: recognition that she had genuinely lost. Not just the case, not just her expected inheritance, but the relationship itself. Whatever bond had existed between mother and daughter had been severed by her choices, and that severance was permanent. I felt nothing in that moment except a quiet sense of completion. 2 weeks later, I returned to court for the plea and sentencing hearing. This time I brought Helen with me for support, and we sat together in the gallery watching as Lauren and Brett formally entered guilty pleas to all charges. Judge Patterson accepted the pleas and moved directly to sentencing. "Lauren Holloway and Brett Holloway, you have pleaded guilty to attempted fraud, filing false legal documents, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse against Patricia Morrison. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of family trust, and the protection society owes to its vulnerable members. While I acknowledge that you have no prior criminal records, I cannot overlook the calculated and deliberate nature of your actions. You spent months planning and executing a scheme to deprive a competent woman of her autonomy and property. You recruited professionals to participate in your fraud. You attempted to manipulate the legal system into giving you authority you had not earned and did not deserve. The fact that you were unsuccessful does not diminish the gravity of your attempt." Judge Patterson paused and looked directly at Lauren. "Mrs. Holloway, what you did to your mother is particularly reprehensible, because it exploited the trust that should exist between parent and child. Your mother loved you, supported you, and planned to leave you a generous inheritance. Rather than wait for that natural inheritance and maintain a loving relationship, You chose greed and betrayal. You have destroyed your family for money you will never receive. And you have forfeited not only your inheritance but your relationship with your mother. I hope that in the years to come, you will reflect on whether that trade was worth it. He turned to Brett. Mr. Holloway, you enabled and encouraged your wife's betrayal of her mother. Your professional connections were instrumental in recruiting fraudulent inspectors and property assessors. Your influence pushed what might have been merely a difficult family dynamic into criminal conduct. You too must face the consequences of those choices. The sentences Judge Patterson imposed were substantial even with the plea agreement. Lauren and Brett each received 5-year suspended sentences, meaning they would not serve time immediately, but any violation of their probation conditions would result in incarceration. They were ordered to pay my complete legal fees and expenses, which totaled over $60,000. They were each required to complete 500 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that protect elderly people from abuse. And the protective order was made permanent, meaning they could never contact me again for any reason without facing immediate criminal consequences. As the final gavel fell and the hearing concluded, I felt Helen take my hand and squeeze it supportively. "It's really over," she whispered. "Yes," I replied. "It's really over." But even as I said the words, I knew that the emotional aftermath would take much longer to process than the legal case had taken to resolve. The following months brought a strange kind of peace mixed with occasional waves of grief that would hit me without warning. I would be working in my garden, the garden that I had fought so hard to keep, and suddenly find myself crying for the daughter I thought I had, the relationship I thought we shared, the future I had imagined where we would grow closer as I aged rather than becoming adversaries in a courtroom. Helen reminded me during one of these grief episodes that I was not mourning the loss of Lauren, but rather the loss of my illusions about who Lauren actually was. "You are grieving the death of a relationship that never really existed," she said gently. "The daughter you thought you had, who would cherish you and protect you and value your well-being over money, that daughter was always a fiction you created, because you wanted to believe the best of your child. The real Lauren, the one who..." 2 years after Judge Patterson's sentencing hearing, I received an unexpected letter from someone I had not heard from since the legal proceedings ended. It was from Michael Torres, the public defender who had represented Lauren and Brett. "Mrs. Morrison," the letter began, "I hope this letter finds you well, and that you will forgive the intrusion of contact through postal mail. I want you to know that representing your daughter and son-in-law in their criminal case was one of the most ethically challenging experiences of my career. As a defense attorney, I am obligated to provide the best representation I can to my clients regardless of the nature of their alleged crimes. However, I must tell you that reviewing the evidence of what they attempted to do to you was deeply disturbing. The calculated nature of their scheme, the manipulation of professionals and systems, the willingness to destroy their relationship with you for financial gain, all of it represented a level of family betrayal that I found genuinely shocking. I am writing to you now because Lauren Holloway has recently contacted me, asking if I thought there was any possibility of reconciliation with you. She claims to have gained insight through therapy and her community service work into how wrong her actions were. She wanted to know if I thought you might be willing to meet with her to discuss rebuilding some form of relationship. I told her honestly that after representing her in court and reviewing the full scope of what she did, I could not imagine why you would ever trust her again, and that attempting to contact you even indirectly might constitute a violation of the protective order. She asked me to convey to you that she is sorry, and that she understands she destroyed something irreparable. I am sharing this not because I think you owe your daughter anything you do not, but because I thought you might want to know that she has at least reached a point of acknowledging the gravity of her actions. Whether that acknowledgement represents genuine growth or simply another manipulation, I cannot say. Please know that your courage in fighting back against your daughter's exploitation, and your willingness to share your experience to help others has made a real difference. I have shared your story with identifying details removed, with other elderly clients facing similar situations, and your example has given several of them the strength to protect themselves. Thank you for that, and I wish you continued health and peace." I read Michael Torres's letter 3 times, trying to process my feelings about Lauren's reported remorse. Was it genuine? Had she truly gained insight into how wrong her actions were? Or was this simply another strategy, an attempt to make me lower my guard by appealing to my desire for reconciliation? I shared the letter with Martin, who read it carefully before responding. Patricia, only you can decide whether you believe Lauren's remorse is genuine, or whether you have any interest in reconciliation. But I would urge you to consider what reconciliation would actually look like. Even if Lauren is sincerely sorry, that does not mean she is safe to have in your life. Remorse does not undo behavior patterns that took years to develop. It does not eliminate the entitlement that led her to believe she deserved your assets before you were dead. And it does not change the fact that she spent months systematically trying to destroy your independence through fraud and manipulation. You can forgive her if you choose without ever speaking to her again. Forgiveness is about your peace, not about giving her another chance to hurt you. Martin was right, and I knew it. I could forgive Lauren for what she had done, could release the anger and resentment that occasionally still surfaced, without ever having to see her or speak to her again. Forgiveness did not require reconciliation, and reconciliation with someone who had tried to steal everything I had would be foolish rather than compassionate. I wrote a brief response to Michael Torres thanking him for his letter, and informing him that while I hoped Lauren had genuinely learned from her consequences, I had no interest in contact or reconciliation of any kind. The protective order would remain in place, and any attempt by Lauren to reach me even indirectly would be treated as a violation. I asked him to convey to Lauren that the best thing she could do for me was to respect my boundaries and leave me alone. Whether she accepted that message or viewed it as a temporary setback, I would probably never know. But I had said what needed to be said, and I could move forward knowing I had made the choice that protected my well-being rather than prioritizing Lauren's feelings or desires. The third anniversary of Judge Brennan's ruling denying Lauren's guardianship petition fell on a crisp autumn day, and I marked it by hosting a small gathering at my home for the Silver Defenders and some other friends who had supported me through the legal battles. We sat in my living room, the living room Lauren had tried to convince courts and professionals I was no longer capable of maintaining, and we celebrated survival, independence, and the power of documentation and legal knowledge to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. Robert Chun was there with Margaret, and he presented me with a framed copy of his original inspection report, the document that had been crucial in proving Dennis Crawford's report fraudulent. "This inspection saved your independence," he said as he handed it to me. "I am honored that my work played a role in protecting you." I hung the framed inspection in my office where I could see it every day. A reminder that sometimes the most important protection we can have is objective truth documented by professionals who have no agenda beyond accuracy. Helen raised a toast that evening. To Patricia, who showed all of us that getting older does not mean becoming vulnerable, that loving your children does not mean tolerating their abuse, and that fighting back against family betrayal is not only possible but necessary. We all raised our glasses, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the community I had built, the relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. These people, Helen and Robert and Margaret and the Silver Defenders and my attorney Martin and the volunteers at Elder Rights Connecticut, they were my real family. They had chosen to support me, to stand with me, to celebrate my victories and mourn my losses. That choice, freely made and continually renewed, meant more than any biological connection ever could. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I stood on my porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood I loved, in the home I had fought to keep. At 61 years old, I was exactly where I wanted to be, surrounded by people who valued me, engaged in work that mattered, and free from the manipulation that had nearly destroyed everything I had built. Lauren had tried to steal my home, my independence, and my future. She had failed, and in failing, she had lost not only her expected inheritance, but something far more valuable that she probably did not even realize was gone until it was too late. She had lost the privilege of being part of my life. That was a consequence she would carry for the rest of her days, and it was exactly what her choices had earned her. 5 years have passed since that autumn gathering, and I find myself reflecting on how dramatically my life has changed from the woman I was when Lauren first brought those power of attorney documents to my dining room table. I am 66 now, and every year that passes feels like a victory, not just of survival but of thriving in ways I never imagined possible when I was fighting to protect my independence. The house remains mine, well-maintained and filled with the kind of warmth that comes from genuine connection rather than obligation. My garden has become something of a neighborhood landmark, and I spend my mornings there when weather permits, tending to roses and vegetables with a sense of peace that comes from knowing this space is truly mine and will remain so as long as I choose. The work with Elder Rights Connecticut expanded beyond anything I anticipated. What started as occasional speaking engagements became a formal program where I train other elderly survivors of financial exploitation to become advocates and educators. We have helped hundreds of people recognize warning signs, document evidence, and protect themselves from family members who view their parents as assets rather than people deserving of dignity and autonomy. Martin Chambers retired last year, and at his retirement party, he pulled me aside to tell me that my case had been one of the most satisfying of his entire career. Not because of the legal complexity, he said, but because you showed what is possible when someone refuses to be a victim and fights back with intelligence and determination. You changed the trajectory of elder law in this state, Patricia. Judges and attorneys now know that elderly people can and will fight exploitation, and that makes would-be abusers think twice. I never heard from Lauren again after Michael Torres conveyed my message about respecting boundaries. Whether she found peace with her choices or continues to resent losing what she felt entitled to, I do not know and no longer wonder about. The protective order remains in place, and I have built a life so full and meaningful that her absence creates no void. Helen visits regularly, and we have become each other's primary family, the relationship we should have had all along before my focus on Lauren consumed so much energy and attention. My will is updated and ironclad, leaving everything to charities that protect elderly people from abuse, and to individuals like Rosa Martinez's family, people who showed loyalty and courage when it mattered most. Lauren will receive nothing, and the document clearly explains why, creating a record that cannot be challenged or reinterpreted. On quiet evenings, I sit in my living room and remember the woman who almost drank that poisoned coffee of manipulation and fraud Lauren prepared for me. I remember how close I came to signing away my independence, to believing the lies about my competence and my home's condition, to trusting that family would never truly harm me. That woman was saved by documentation, legal knowledge, and the courage to trust her instincts even when doing so meant confronting painful truths about her daughter. I am grateful to her for fighting back, for refusing to be gaslit or manipulated, for choosing truth over comfort. The home inspector my daughter hired found major issues until I showed him the inspection from last month. That moment of producing Robert Chen's report and watching Dennis Crawford's fraud collapse was the beginning of reclaiming my power. It was the moment I stopped being a potential victim and became someone who would fight for what was mine. My life now is not what I planned when David and I bought this house decades ago. I imagined growing old with him, watching Lauren build her own family, being a grandmother to children who would run through these rooms with the same joy Lauren once had. That future died long before Lauren's betrayal made it official, and grieving it was necessary before I could build something new. What I have now is different but no less valuable. A chosen family built on mutual respect, work that helps others avoid the exploitation I nearly suffered, and the satisfaction of knowing I protected not just my property but my dignity and autonomy. The protective order that keeps Lauren away is not just a legal document, but a symbol of boundaries that should have been set much earlier. It represents the truth that love without respect is meaningless, that family obligations do not include tolerating abuse, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse contact with people who have proven they will harm you given the opportunity. I am often asked by other elderly people in similar situations whether cutting off a child is the right choice. My answer is always the same. The right choice is the one that protects your safety, your independence, and your peace of mind. If that means ending a relationship with someone who tried to exploit you, then that is not just right but necessary. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation, and you can wish someone well from a great distance while maintaining boundaries that protect you from further harm. As I approach my later years, I do so with confidence that my affairs are in order, my independence is protected, and my legacy will benefit causes I care about rather than someone who tried to steal it prematurely. Lauren taught me the hardest lesson of my life, that biology creates connection but character creates family. She failed the character test in ways I could never have imagined, and the consequences she faces are entirely of her own making. The sun is setting on another day in the home I fought to keep, and I am content in ways that transcend material comfort or financial security. I am content because I know who I am, what I am capable of, and what I deserve. I am content because I chose truth over denial, boundaries over obligation, and self-protection over misplaced family loyalty. The home inspector my daughter hired tried to steal my future with lies about my present. Instead, his fraud exposed a truth I needed to see, and that truth, painful as it was, set me free to build the life I was meant to live. That is a gift I never expected from betrayal, but it is one I treasure nonetheless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.